Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. So today we have discussions about China, BRI, and implication on digital governance, authoritarianism, and future of human rights. So in 2013, President Xi Jinping launched this big global infrastructure development project, popularly known as Belt and Road Initiative. And the project sought to revive and expand the Silk Road trading route that historically connects China with Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. And Belt and Road is a very ambitious global infrastructure project that spans over 140 countries. And along with this, the another umbrella project or another major project that is part of Belt and Road Initiative is the Digital Silk Road major project. It aims to expand China's reach to the domain of digital technology, data flow, and cyber governance. And over 80 countries have joined the Digital Silk Road. And for today's discussions, we largely focuses on China, BRI, and global governance from the perspective of South Asia, especially from Nepal, and then from the perspective of Tibetan refugees, and then Hong Kong dissidents. So we aim to cover so many topics here, largely focusing on this area. All right, so we have four very important speakers to discuss about this whole issue. And so without taking much time, I would like to invite our speakers, but before that, I want to give brief introductions about all of the speakers to our audience. So firstly, we have Michael Castor. He is a human rights advocate and a researcher specializing in China and Southeast Asia. He is currently the head of the Global China Program of Article 19, and where he manages projects on internet freedom and digital rights. So Article 19 has expertise in documenting the trends and nuances of online disinformation, including during election in Asia and the Pacific. They have also published an extensive report on the implication of digital Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Yes. Hello,
Hello. Can you
Doma.
hear
We
me?
can hear you.
Yeah, go
We can
ahead.
hear you, Doma.
Hello.
Yes,
Oh, I'm sorry.
you can go ahead.
Okay. I apologize for this internet interruption. So quickly, yes. And for the second, Digital Security Program Director, he was on the advisory board of the Citizen Clinic, a public interest cybersecurity clinic at the University of California, Berkeley, between 2018 to 2020. For more than 10 years, he has worked closely with Tibetans, communicating with Tibetan inside Tibet on digital security, censorship, and surveillance in Tibet. He is also a member of 17 Tibetan Parliament in exile that is based in India. And for third speaker, we have Mahesh Kumar Kushwaha. He is a researcher associated with Center for Social Innovation and Foreign Policy based in Nepal. And his research focuses on the intricate interplay among technology, artificial intelligence, and international security. Last but not least, we have Zheng Zilu, a pro-democrat activist. He was a member of Civil Human Rights Front and the Hong Kong Labour Party. After the impositions of a national security law in Hong Kong in 2020, he moved to Taiwan. So since then, he has been living in Taiwan as an exile. So I would like to give a reminder to all the speakers that each of you have 20 to 25. And then last 30 minutes of discussion will open for public discussion or for the question and answer session. So without taking much time, may I invite Michael to start today's presentation. Michael?
Sure. Thank you very much, Doma. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be speaking about these important topics with the other speakers. And I'm really looking forward to hearing also what you have to say. I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation. And just to make things a little easier, I'm going to turn off my video while doing that. Wait, sorry. Stop video. Okay. Of course, it wouldn't be a conversation around digital issues without a series of technical problems, right? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, it's
Yes.
very clear.
Great, okay. So I am going to try to sort of begin the conversation by placing our understanding, our sort of narrative on the digital component, the digital Silk Road, the digital component of the Belt and Road Initiative, understanding China's laws, policies, institutions, sort of the normative framework that it has developed nationally, that it has promoted through its partnerships, through force, through coercion, in partner countries along the digital Silk Road, and as this larger sort of international norm setting in shaping digital governance in a way that moves away from a rights-respecting human rights framework for internet governance to one that is more modeled and shaped around China's authoritarian vision. And so in doing that, I will touch on a number of points that I will hopefully be able to get through. Again, with the limited time and the depth of the material, it will be a bit cursory, but please reach out. I'd love to talk about any of these points in more detail. In doing so, I'm going to go through some of the laws and policies that are shaping China's approach to digital governance nationally, because again, this is influencing the norm setting, their approach, and how they're pushing for a rewriting of digital governance norms. Touching on briefly sort of our argument for how we position or how we think about the prevailing digital governance norms themselves, and some of the institutions that are responsible for this. And it's important, we think, to discuss the institutions of digital governance in China, because many of them are very much involved in promoting China's vision, in cooperation agreements, or providing the surveillance technology that is used to restrict the rights of Tibetans in India and Nepal, for example, as we'll hear about later, and so forth. And so we're looking at laws, policies, and institutions. And then after establishing that, touching on some of the milestones, sort of the evolution of the digital Silk Road. So positioning that over the last decade or so, because again, the role that China has played in promoting digital authoritarianism, in stripping away rights to freedom of expression, or right to privacy online, it has not been by coincidence or by chance. It is by design. And it is not by guesswork or implication that we know this. We know this because it's exactly what they have said in documents, policies, strategies that they have put out. So in situating the digital Silk Road, we can really see where the priorities are, where the promotion of these digital governance norms that are restrictive of human rights have been. We won't go into the details of the case studies much. I just want to flag a couple of points of how the digital Silk Road partnerships in the Indo-Pacific have played out in an alarming way. And if there's time, a few high-level recommendations for consideration. So beginning with the laws and policies, there's a lot that we can look to, of course. Some of the most significant ICT laws in China that shape both the domestic digital governance landscape, but also how China is promoting legislative change, digital development, and others. The counter-espionage law, which originally was 2014, revised in 2023, national intelligence law, data security law. There's some others that are important we'll get to in a moment. But what we see, and again, I think for those of us who have been following this closely, it's no surprise, but what we see is a legal obligation on institutions, individuals, organizations, companies, government employees, obviously members of the party, etc., a legal obligation to be parties to the surveillance apparatus of the state, to gather information, to retain data, to make it available to the authorities for access, but also to monitor and to control information on the through various information infrastructures and networks, which touches on the surveillance side, but also the freedom of expression and censorship side. The sort of gold standard, if you will, in repressive internet governance, digital governance, it really is the cybersecurity law, in force since 2017, backed up by various other sort of implementation decrees and other orders that have come out since. This provides the sort of backbone of China's approach, repressive model. And what we've seen, unfortunately, is in the diffusion, the adoption of either in explicitly cybersecurity laws in other countries, so laws and policies, so Nepal's national cybersecurity policy, Cambodia's draft cybersecurity law, Vietnam's cybersecurity law. We see really emulation of China's approach to governing cybersecurity through this law, which is highly, highly problematic and concerning from a human rights perspective, again, because of these trends that we see. Retention, monitoring, network traffic, requiring real name identification, providing technical support. These are all obligations on network operators and other actors to be parties to the surveillance apparatus, but also to monitor, to censor prohibited information. It securitizes speech in information infrastructure in ways that go way beyond any internationally accepted requirement for protecting or preserving cybersecurity. It's about securitizing information within infrastructure. It's censorship at the infrastructure level, as we'll see. Also, the cybersecurity law establishes a legal basis for network shutdowns or internet shutdowns. China was one of the first countries really to weaponize bandwidth throttling or access to the internet back in 2009 and 10, following riots in Urumqi in East Turkestan. The cybersecurity law in Article 58 seeks to provide the legal provision to effectively do this. And again, this is something we've seen throughout the region and globally, from India to Indonesia and other countries, sort of really increasingly weaponizing network interferences around various events. One other piece of legislation I think to highlight is the 2021 Critical Information Infrastructure Security Protection Regulations, which came out several years after the cybersecurity law to define or to attempt to define some of the elements that were left relatively vague within the provisions of the cybersecurity law, and in particular, the CII, Critical Information Infrastructure. It's still relatively open-ended. Obviously, the what the frameworks say on paper also needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because the absence of rule of law, of an independent judiciary, of effective checks and balances. So whether it's precise or vague, ultimately within the legislative or sort of policy landscape in China, again, is somewhat of a moot point, but it's still, I think, important from analysis based on international best practices and where we want precision and so forth. It's still unnecessarily vague and sort of open-ended that allows for repression and restrictions of infrastructure. It's left up to the management of the Ministry of Public Security, Cyberspace Administration of China, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. These three, plus the National Development and Reform Commission, are kind of the four main institutions, state and party institutions responsible for developing, implementing, enforcing digital governance policy in China, but also who are key sort of, again, state and party interlocutors in China's norm setting and sort of global engagement in this space. Again, in 2022, we saw some more legislation, the security review measures, which touches more on some of the issues around infrastructure. In Hong Kong, then just last year also, there was a infrastructure bill that came into force, that was agreed upon, which models on a lot of these same concerning provisions. Moving on from the laws and policies, sort of as we position the digital governance norms, we would argue that sort of these are the three prevailing norms. By all means, open to pushback, consideration. Should we be much broader in discussing the sort of normative framework that China is approaching digital governance with? Or is this instructive? Is this really helpful at all? But what we would argue is the three prevailing norms: cyber sovereignty, almost ancient now from a 2010 white paper, but really this argument that within Chinese territory, the internet is under the jurisdiction of Chinese sovereignty. The argument being that what happens in the physical state of the sort of political, physical boundary of the state is under the jurisdiction of the state, and that the state is then able to pass laws and policies as it wishes in terms of the governance of cyberspace. The sort of technical, fallacy of this itself in the, globally interconnected nature of the internet itself, aside from a human rights perspective, this is highly concerning and problematic. It goes to the heart, the most, fundamental sort of principles of human rights themselves, which are universal, indivisible, and interdependent, meaning that they apply equally within a state, across its borders, irrespective of political boundaries, online and offline, the same. In the same way that states are not permitted to allow for torture or extrajudicial killing within their boundaries simply because it is within their boundaries. These are crimes under international law. And so for that human rights, the universality applies equally online, offline. So this concept, very concerning, very much this sort of foundation for, repressive, anti-human rights-based digital governance that has been diffused through the digital Silk Road engagement, that China has had with pushing its norms. Multilateralism, the second. Again, the concept here based on the centralization of power under the party, multilateral, state to state, or within a confluence of states, does not leave open the room for multi-stakeholderism. So less inclusive, less transparent, less consultative, especially does not create an opening for civil society to take part in the process. Multilateralism as a normative approach to internet governance and digital governance is anathema to existing best practices for a rights-based, free, open, secure, interoperable internet. And China is trying to push against that and completely upend the current international approach in this regard. And finally, the sort of securitization of digital development, or security and development. And this again goes back to some of the points that I made about the cybersecurity law, securitizing information along infrastructure level. This treats potentially critical content of the party as one and the same with threats to national security, aside from being, again, completely at odds with international human rights and particular permissible limitations on the freedom of expression. What we see is an embrace of this type of approach to securitizing information at the infrastructure level in governance in other countries that leads to greater censorship and at times also surveillance. One of the main institutions responsible for developing, enforcing some of these policies at the national level, and again, of course, in its global partnerships, is the Cyberspace Administration of China, which has sort of evolved over the decade and a half of its existence. Initially in 2011, it was set up under the State Council as the State Internet Information Office. It was part of the Propaganda Office. Well, this combined role for what has become the Cyberspace Administration of China, internet governance, digital governance, and information control, manipulation, part of its propagandizing efforts. This has remained, and I think it's a really important point to emphasize that, as well as the sort of securitization that inherent in China's approach to digital governance is then this sort of embrace of information controls, information manipulation. But we see how the Cyberspace Administration of China has evolved over time, particularly after Xi Jinping came to power. First, it was elevated in 2014 and sort of merged with this newly created Central Leading Small Group for Cybersecurity and Information. And then in 2018, further elevated under the Central Committee. So moving outside of the State Council under the Central Committee, placing it outside of the sort of ostensibly state institutions into a party institution. And again, as the CCP leads on all things, this elevation and sort of transfer of authority with Xi Jinping sitting at the head of this entity now under the Central Committee shows the sort of real elevation, the increasing priority and seriousness with which China has placed on developing and enforcing digital governance, as well as sort of influencing what it looks like globally. Moving from some of the sort of state and party institutions, also briefly to talk about the, quote unquote, and obviously we put it in air quotes because the majority of the national tech champions in China, the Alibabas, the Tencents, and so forth, are really not private entities in any real shape or form. But in any case, we have companies laws, we have sort of regulations around the appearance of the private tech sector. So just kind of keeping that in mind. But what we see is the increasing party capture of the tech sector. And why it's important, I think, just to point to some of this is, again, while the laws and policies are often pointed to in discussing the concerns from surveillance or information threats perspective that Chinese tech companies have along, say, digital Silk Road partnerships or globally, whether it's ByteDance, whether it's, TikTok or WeChat or whatever globally, there's also the requirements upon the companies to create the party organizations or party cells within their decision-making processes. So we see laws and policies that require them to be part of the surveillance and censorship apparatus and to increasingly align decision-making internally with party priorities. And in particular, in 2020, the opinions on strengthening the United Front work of the private economy in the new era, and again, private economy in heavy quotes here, but what we see is this is a requirement upon the tech sector, other actors, but here, particular relevance are tech companies to play a role in China's United Front work. And this is heavily tied with the information manipulation operations that China engages in, also obviously heavily tied up with the surveillance, the repression, and engaging in international narratives against Uyghur, Tibetan, Taiwanese communities, either in Tibet, in the diaspora, against Taiwanese, etc. So United Front operations, again, as those of us who follow closely aware, one of the more nefarious vehicles by which China engages in surveillance, repression, and so forth, but also heavily tied up with influencing how tech companies operate along Belt and Road, Digital Silk Road cooperation, promoting policies, priorities, but also being parties to, again, that information manipulation space. I think I'm going to skip this, but again, generally, if you're less familiar with United Front work, definitely important to dig into in more detail. So moving forward to quickly kind of run through some of the evolution of the Digital Silk Road. As Dolma said, kind of it's a decade old now. Early, references comes out in some of the initial conceptualization of what the then also nascent Belt and Road Initiative was. We see from the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and later the National Development and Reform Commission, some white papers, some strategies coming out about how to focus on digital elements within the Belt and Road Initiative. What we see through a decade of policies and planning documents, again, as I mentioned in my introductory comments here, where the priorities are. So the physical layer of the internet, absolutely a priority, from the laying of undersea fiber optic cables, or later emphasizing more satellite information infrastructure. If you're following what's happening in Taiwan recently, part of the development and laying of fiber optic cables we are now seeing is also about patenting offensive mechanisms for also destroying other fiber optic cables as part of cyber warfare, which is part of this as well. We see throughout these priorities, these documents, again, time and time again, a large emphasis on not just digital development, but pushing norms and engaging with stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific, in China's sort of immediate periphery, in its immediate backyard. Second to Asia-Pacific countries, Africa often is the sort of next, closest sort of target that China lays out in a lot of these documents for collaboration, digital development, and obviously promotion of its norms. Going through this again, just time and time again, reiterating its policies. And then I think just kind of concluding here on this section on the, again, this white paper from 2022, the concept of a community with a shared destiny and the various other sort of framings is a narrative device that has been seen through a lot of party policymaking and priorities, particularly under Xi Jinping. It sounds good, but it's a alarming concept that doesn't actually promote the the unity, the collectiveness that certain parties, state parties who have bought onto it have claimed. It's clearly it's a hierarchical establishment of community under the supremacy of the normative frameworks that China is promoting, and a lot of this is emphasized again very much in this document. We see reiterating the cyber sovereignty model, focus again on the cybersecurity issues in particular, the countries that China has prioritized. It's a very illustrative document of where China is and sort of where it's aiming to go in the coming few years. I think just very quickly to run through these in my remaining couple of minutes here, and I'll end. Our research last year, we put out a report looking at the digital Silk Road in the Indo-Pacific. We looked at Cambodia, Malaysia, Nepal, and Thailand. This year, we have a report coming out soon, next month, that looks specifically at China's development and diffusion of cybersecurity governance norms, in which we are looking at Indonesia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. In a lot of these cases, one of the prevailing themes is that China is promoting its authoritarian vision of digital governance through these sort of knowledge sharing, people-to-people exchanges, providing skill building, because there is admittedly a capacity dearth in digital development, infrastructure, systems administration, IT, etc., in a lot of the countries that we are talking about. But in promoting this capacity building, China is also promoting its norms, its standards for the governance of these same technologies, which it comes off as being this, friendly, innocuous exchange for pure capacity building, for developing the digital infrastructure and some of the frameworks in these countries. But is in the case, for example, in Nepal, often at the sort of quid pro quo of China will provide capacity and infrastructure development for Nepal while the Nepali government agrees to continue to surveil and restrict the freedoms of the Tibetan community or adhere to the one China policy and so forth from China. So it's often a quid pro quo in that regard as well. One of the things that we've identified also through Digital Silk Road cooperation in these three countries in particular is that while there's a number of the Chinese surveillance technologies that have been sanctioned at the international level for their role in contributing to, in particular, the surveillance and leading to widespread detention and other gross human rights abuses against Uyghurs in China, we see MOUs and developing cooperation with these companies in some of these countries along the Digital Silk Road, which obviously has incredibly concerning risk potential for various marginalized or targeted communities in these countries. I'm just going to skip over the country case studies, and I think in interest of time, I won't discuss the recommendations now, but happy to kind of go into them later. So thank you all very much. This is a QR code for the report from last year. If you're interested, also please reach out, find me on email, etc. Really excited to hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I agree. It's absolutely unfair for you to give you only 25 minutes and then ask you to cover this massive topic, in 25 minutes. But you have done absolute justice in this short period. You have brought us through how China digital governance and its control over the digital infrastructures has evolved and more into like more centralized nature of control. And then also about like securitization of information and weaponizations of internet and digital technology that penetrate through the norms of cyber sovereignty, multilateralism, and then security and development. So again, we are very honored to have you, and thank you so much. And next, may I invite Lobsang? Next speaker, we have Lobsang from India.
Hey, thank you so much, Toma, yes. So, hi everyone, I'm Lobsang, and I'm with Tibet Action Institute, as Toma mentioned earlier. And I want to thank Toma and the International Center for Cultural Studies for hosting this panel. And I think it's a really important topic that I think requires a lot more discussions, especially I think as Michael already mentioned, and which I think also really lays the groundwork for me to talk a bit more about Tibet and how that actually impacts Tibet, and how a lot of these laws and how like China's changing of global norm doesn't only impact Tibetans inside Tibet, but also globally. So I wanted to, let me just share my presentation. And as Michael said earlier, I'll also turn off my video so it's a bit easier for me to speak. Okay, just give me a second. Okay. So thank you all for joining us. And I wanted to talk a bit about Xi Jinping's expansion, and especially along the lines of digital repression of Tibetans, and how I wanted to talk about three different aspects of this. First, I wanted to talk about a bit about like what has changed after Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, and how that has impacted a lot of the repression tools, or like how Tibetans are being repressed both inside Tibet and outside Tibet, and what his goals are. And then I also wanted to talk a bit about the different tactics used, and then finally a bit more about how when repression happens, but at the same time there is resistance, right? So I do want to leave all of us on a positive note, in terms of like just thinking about how Tibetans are resisting a lot of that. So without taking much time, let me just start it, right? And I wanted to talk a bit about like in terms of like Xi Jinping, right, how it has changed. And the reason why I have these two photos is like both these are schools. The one on the right is a boarding school that is currently in Tibet, and the photo on the left is of a school before 2012. So the reason why I wanted to show these two schools, and not really just go into the pictures, but I just wanted to talk more about like Xi's policy of assimilation or erasure. And this is something that is critical for understanding how Xi's repression works in Tibet, and the digital repression and all the different aspects of how Xi is trying to repress the Tibetan community inside Tibet, the Tibetans inside Tibet, as well as the Tibetan community in the diaspora. So the difference in those two things is very critical to understanding Xi's goal, because I feel like if you look at before 2012 and before Xi Jinping came to power, there was a lot of about how Tibetans should be integrated into Chinese system, right? So it was not about basically like completely eradication of Tibetan identity, right? Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion. There were certain elements of repression. However, it was always about how do you integrate Tibetans into the Chinese way of life, or the Chinese system, or the Chinese culture. There was some kind of integration, and how Tibetans are still able to keep certain aspects of their own culture. But what Xi Jinping right now is trying to do is a complete assimilation, right? It's kind of like an erasure of the Tibetan identity. So this is where I feel like we have to understand how the repression works. And this is something that I wanted to talk about in terms of like just kind of setting up the understanding of how a lot of these policies or repressive policies, repressive tactics are being used to actually towards a goal of assimilation rather than integration. And I have two photos here, and I want to talk about these two photos because I think when you talk about Tibet, right, and I think how digital repression works is how do you erase Tibet from the narrative or from the global consciousness, right? And the photo on the left is a self-immolation photo from November 3rd, 2011 of Ani Pandit Chozo, a nun in eastern Tibet, and that was a self-immolation that happened inside Tibet. And we have the video of it. I was like working with a team that actually got the video from inside Tibet. If you see the video, there's a woman who's actually throwing a scarf to pay respects to the self-immolator. And this got a lot of international attention. There was a lot of like information about this. There was a lot of media story that was being covered about self-immolation because of certain videos that came out of Tibet. And there was also a few other photos and videos that came out of Tibet around that time of self-immolation. The second photo is Cao Nobu. So Cao Nobu is a Tibetan singer who self-immolated in February 25th, 2022. And we don't have any photo of him doing his at the act. We don't have a photo of him as a self-immolation when he was self-immolating. And we were only able to get an information about the self-immolation of Cao Nobu after a week the self-immolation happened. So this happened in February 25th, 2022, and we were only able to know about the self-immolation like after a week or so. And one interesting aspect of that is like the self-immolation happened outside the Potala Palace, near the Potala Palace. And as many of you may know, Potala Palace is the seat of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and it is one of the most visited places in Tibet. And a recent report also states that there's no image from February 28th on Chinese social media. So you won't find any images from Lhasa on that day. So everything's scrubbed. All of that information has disappeared. So one of the things why I want to talk about this is the fact that like there's a systematic way of thinking about how can we erase Tibet from the global consciousness, right? And to do that is like making sure that there's if you think about now, like trying to find photos of what's happening inside Tibet, videos of like protests, a lot of that information that you can't get, and it's becoming much, much harder under Xi Jinping to get a lot of this information. And when that happens, it's really hard for any journalist or any international media organization, any group to actually talk about Tibet because, first of all, there's no access to go inside Tibet, like for journalists or independent like researchers, right? So that has always been the case. But we used to be able to get photos and videos, especially after 2008, but all of that has disappeared. So there's a lot more censorship online, which restricts a lot of the flow of information. And that really is one of the tactics of like trying to erase Tibet from the global consciousness, right? And you may have noticed recently in the last year or so, there is also the kind of like the movement or like the policy from the Chinese side to actually even erase the word Tibet, right? The reference of Tibet, instead of calling Tibet Tibet, in English is about Shizang, right? Using the Chinese word. And this is something that's being promoted by the Chinese state media. This is being promoted by different partners with the Chinese government. So different places like that have like relationships with China will start using Shizang instead of Tibet to even refer to Tibet. So this is what I want to talk about in terms of like Xi Jinping's kind of like policies of trying to do that, right? So I think in terms of like trying to control the Tibet narrative, right? Like trying to control Tibet, there's three important aspects of that. One is fear, right? How do you instill more fear into people? How do you make sure that people are afraid of doing anything online? How do you repress them? How do you use the digital technologies to create so much fear that people are suspicious of other like of the neighbors, suspicious of their friends, and ultimately leading to how do you make sure that people are self-censoring themselves? So this is kind of, I think, the strategy and the underlying goals of like trying to use a lot of these different tools. So in terms of like digital repression, one thing that I wanted to talk about is and the kind of looking at one of the most important aspects of how digital repression or one of the tools or tactics is about WeChat, right? And WeChat allows us to see a lot of the different aspects of how it has changed, right? So for example, like WeChat came into the Tibetan, not only the Tibetan, but in the Chinese community around late 2009, 10, 11, I can't remember exact dates, but then in early 2010s, it started kind of like spreading across, not only across Tibet, inside Tibet, but also across the diaspora. And it allowed a space for Tibetans to communicate to each other. But at the same time, if you remember around those times, there was also a lot of different apps. So it wasn't that Tibetans and like Tibetans were relying only on one app. They weren't relying just on WeChat. There was Kakao, there was Line, there was WhatsApp. There was a lot of different apps that also allowed you to communicate with each other, right? And a lot of those apps were available inside Tibet and in China. But then, as Michael said earlier, how do you build that system, right? Like, so the different laws that were being implemented allowed the Chinese government to actually like reduce that, right? So now if you look at like alternatives on the Chinese App Store market, right? We recently conducted a research on Chinese App Store market. You cannot get most international communication tools. Anything that has encryption, a lot of those are missing. And if you look at the Chinese Android App Store market, which is also really wide, we actually looked for, I think, about 15 different like secure apps, and we only found one secure app on two Chinese app stores, and one was a fake one, which was trying to install malware on your computer. So there's not a lot of alternatives. So WeChat tends to be the only thing that can be used. And in the beginning, WeChat allowed people to have conversations, to have group chats, all of that. But then what started happening a bit more and more is like how it started to censor content, right? So for example, the image that you see is from research that we conducted with Citizen Lab. This was in 2017. So if you look at the China account, right, and the India account. So if you're trying to have a conversation within a group chat where there are multiple users on WeChat from Tibet, from India, from global, right? What happens is like, if you're talking about certain things, so for example, you see the conversation. So somebody's saying, hello, how are you, right? And if you say like from inside Tibet, Kalachakra, Dalai Lama, and you can see certain messages are being censored, right? So that is something that started to happen a lot more on WeChat in terms of trying to censor content from trying to differentiate the different two accounts, right? So how do you censor the India account or the global account from the China account? And in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of differences between those two accounts or two WeChat accounts, but it has changed a lot. If you look at like what the Chinese WeChat looks like now versus the global WeChat, it is almost like two different apps. And at the same time, if you look at the news, the number of Tibetans who have been arrested for sharing information on WeChat, like photos of His Holiness, a lot of that has also played a huge part in how that actually, the news cycle, right, about, oh, somebody's being arrested for that, somebody's being arrested for saying something on WeChat. And that has happened a lot. And that also restricts people from talking on WeChat and sharing information. And I think the earlier like talk about like how some of the cybersecurity laws have different directives, right? One of the directives of the 2017 cybersecurity law was in the Tibetan case, it was about liability of group admins. So there was this whole thing about operators being liable for what is said on on a platform, right? So for example, WeChat is liable for what is said on WeChat, right? If this Weibo is liable for what is said on Weibo. So these companies like censor content, scrape content, surveil people, and a lot of that is part of the process, right? At the same time, how some of those laws are being used in directives in different ways in the Tibetan context was like once the law was passed, what happened was like there was like meetings and there was group discussions. There were people like Tibetans who were part of like large WeChat groups were called to the local security officers, right? Officers, and basically said like, okay, you started this group, you're the admin of the group, and people are in the group. So it doesn't matter if who is in the group, but anything that is said in the group, you can be held liable for it. So then the moderation, the censorship is put on, the onus of the censorship is put on group admins because they can be held liable. And that also relates to how self-censorship happens, right? Because like if there's a lot of people who are being liable, and even if in a group there's like Tibetans from inside Tibet, Tibetans from outside, there's a limit of like, because you don't want to make somebody accountable. You don't want to hold somebody like, so something like if there's a Tibetan inside Tibet who might be the group admin, right? So you don't want him to be arrested. You don't want him to be detained. So what happens is like people from outside, we also self-censor ourselves because like we don't want them to get into trouble. So this is something how WeChat has been used in the Tibetan community, especially like as a tool of repression. And one thing that another tactic that I think has been really successful is the grid management system, right? And I think we know what the grid management system is, especially in like something that has been implemented all over China and not just in Tibet. The difference is there's a bit of a difference in how that has been implemented in Tibet, right? So, in part of the grid systems, right? In multiple posts in cities, as per the grid system, right? There's convenience police checkposts, right? And those checkposts are in all Tibetan villages. They are next to monasteries. If you look at like photos from Tibetan monasteries inside Tibet, you'll see a police checkpost just outside the monastery or like just within the boundaries of the monastery. And these checkposts collect biometric data. They have access to CCTV surveillance. They do random device checks. So these are the tools that are used as part of that, right? So because like a Tibetan, like you may have a normal grid system, but all these different tools that are available at these police checkposts make sure that people are afraid of what they have on their devices. And this allows greater control of devices, of online accounts, and all of that as part of that system, right? So this is one of the tactics. And another one is like the whole thing, and I think most of us know about the DNA sample collections, how that has happened in a lot of Tibetan areas, like in most Tibetan areas. And there's been a lot of international outcry on like, what are you doing if you're trying to do it for like even children who are aged 5 and above? As you can see in the photo, the DNA sample is being collected, right? The purpose, like, and there's a lot of discussions about the purpose, how some of these things are being used, but there's also an uncertainty there, right? So when this happens, you don't know what is being used for, and there's a fear of like, can something be done with these data, right? And I think one of the things that I always think about in this space is like, there's a lot of collection of data and how that data is used is also something that also creates the more sense of fear. It creates more suspicion and leads to more self-censorship, right? So a lot of these tactics always go back into like, how do you create more fear in people? How do you create more suspicion? And how do you kind of like instill a culture of self-censorship? So a lot of these tactics kind of go back into the same space of like creating fear and all of that. And what is changing now is, I think, something that I found is the whole thing about, and I have a photo here of this is this very simple, like, it's a simple translation tool. It's a smart pen that I think most of you might have seen if you have ever looked at smart pens in China. iFlyTech does a lot of these tools, and they have actually been working with research centers inside Tibet to work on how do you do that, right? How do you do Tibetan speech to text? How do you do automate all of that? How do you do automated translations? And how do you do facial recognitions of Tibetans, right? And all of these kind of like, one of the things is like, this is something that is, if you look at like even at technical papers, there's a lot of IEEE papers on how to do a lot of these tools, how to do a lot of these automations. And this has really kind of like in the beginning, if you start looking at some of these apps or like some of these keyboards, it was always about how do you preserve Tibetan language and Tibetan culture, which it has supported, right? But at the same time, a lot of these tools and like these technologies are now being used in a lot of different spaces, right? Like whether it's being used in WeChat, whether it's being used for surveillance, whether it's being used for censorship. And these tools have dramatically improved. And what that also allows people to understand is like if you ask any Tibetan, whether they are from inside Tibet, whether they are from the diaspora, they understand that they are censored all the time. They understand they are surveilled on Chinese platforms. So that level of fear, because you know that anything you can be said, right? Like, for example, like if a few years ago, Tibetans would be saying, oh, I won't text on WeChat because that is censored and surveilled, but I can do an audio chat. I can leave an audio message. I can do a video call, and those will be harder to censor or harder to surveil, but that is not the case anymore. So that actually leads to more fear and leads to self-censorship, right? And another thing that I think is interesting, and we only have anecdotal evidence of that, is the access to social media, online accounts data at the local level. So for example, like we know that WeChat is censoring or surveilling Tibetan users, and WeChat as a company has access to censorship and surveillance and can do all of that, and that data is being shared with the Chinese government and all of that. That's kind of clear, right? However, what has changed in the last few years, and we actually have anecdotal evidence of people being called to the local police stations, right, where they are actually shown information about like, oh, you have done this on this, or you have said, you have made a comment on your WeChat group, or you have made a comment on this, or you have said, you have publicly liked a post of something on a Chinese social media platform, whether it's like Douyin, whether it's on Kuaishou, whether it's on Weibo or something like that. So what that actually talks about is the omnipresence of surveillance, right? Because like as even if you're thinking about like us in the rest of the world, right, we have certain things like we look at just a sec. Okay, thank you. Yep, I have 5 more minutes. Okay, perfect. So if you look at like the global case, right? Like, so for example, most of us are using WhatsApp, right? Or if you're using Telegram, and there's this sense that, okay, even if there's something wrong with Facebook about like how it's the data access and stuff like that, there are certain things, right, that we are worried about. But it's at a company level, right? So it's not something that's near to you. So the omnipresence of like surveillance at the local level, that actually really creates more fear and self-censorship. So I think that is why I wanted to talk about this, because it actually goes back into that concept of like, how does that relate to how Tibetans are repressed using digital technologies, right? And another one that I feel is very interesting, because like with the new laws that are being implemented, right, there's always this coinciding public awareness campaigns, right? Like that's part of like, how do you kind of like make sure that people understand what's going on, right? So for example, if you look at here, this is something that came out like called 20 Not to Do's as part of a campaign in Central Tibet, right, in TAR, Tibet Autonomous Region, which was about, oh, you should be very careful about all these documents, right? So this is an RAR file, how that can actually create malware and all of that, right? A lot of those public events campaigns relating to a lot of these new laws have always been about how do you use these campaigns to talk about not the actual issue, but how do you use these to actually kind of like spread more fear, spread more self-censorship, right? So for example, an online rumor is like, what is online rumor? So there's a description of online rumor. And so people are like, okay, you cannot share this. Even if you hear something, you're not allowed to share it because that's creating online rumor. So, or even about disinformation. If you look at the traditional sense of disinformation, or what we think of what disinformation and misinformation is, but from the Chinese point of view, that's not disinformation or misinformation. From the Chinese point of view, is anything that's against state, that's disinformation, right? So certain things like that, and how do you protect children, right? So for example, there was a campaign that was done in Eastern Tibet where it was like, there were certain apps that were being promoted, like on the, I think they were calling it the dark web, but it wasn't really like that, but it was just being promoted in different forums. And it was all about like, how do you use encryption? How do you use end-to-end encrypted tools, right? And the public awareness campaign that went out was about like parents like say, oh, you need to protect your children because if they are using these tools, you will not be able to know what they are talking about. So kind of like really changing the narrative of like security from the perspective of like what we think about public awareness on digital security, all of that, but changing that narrative and kind of like making it about repression, making it about censorship, making it about self-censorship, and kind of creating that environment of fear again. So I think these are some of the things that I think is really important to understand in terms of how China changes a lot of those narratives, right? And so this is some of the tools that are being used inside tactics that are being used inside Tibet to kind of to talk, as I said earlier, about fear, suspicion, and self-censorship. Now, if you look at the in exile or the diaspora community, it's very similar. So if you think about like before 2012 or like even before like when we had WeChat, right? How do you control someone who's outside? It's really hard because like if you think about the Tibetan diaspora community, which is not very huge, it's about 150,000 Tibetans in the diaspora, which is like spread globally, right? Because you need to know who's where. You have to have all those information available to you as a Chinese government to like, okay, I want to target this person. But where do you get all that information? That's really hard. However, WeChat now is the means of surveillance and control. So this is a quote from somebody from a TCHRD report on transnational repression, right? And it basically says like, although I'm still able to contact my family in Tibet, we must choose our words wisely and self-censor. So it's like, okay, we allow you to communicate with your family, we allow you to connect, but at the same time, somebody who's in the outside space, because of the fact that they want to protect their family inside, will self-censor themselves on the forum. Now the question is, the bigger question is, okay, they are censoring themselves on WeChat. Are they still censoring themselves outside of WeChat, which many of them are? Many of them are starting not to go to protests. They are starting not to engage in certain things because they are like, oh, if that image just goes back to Tibet, my family will be in trouble. So that whole thing of using WeChat not as a means of communication, but a means of surveillance and control, right? So this is something that I think is part of the tactics. The second tactic that is, though I think the WeChat as a means of surveillance is not for every Tibetan in the diaspora, right? It only works for Tibetans who have family inside Tibet, who are connected all the time. So there is like a subsection of the Tibetan diaspora community. So for example, like me, I was born in exile and I do not have family inside Tibet. So there's no way to use that as a means to control. So what do you do? So then you kind of like work on like, how do you use targeted attacks? How do you do malware that is being sent to your computers, your mobile? How do you compromise Tibetan websites so that you can get access to information? How do you use those information to do other things, right? Because the moment you're being targeted is a way of thinking about like, you are being targeted, like how much information that is being compromised. So all of these are used in a way to talk about like how that actually happens. And I think this is something that I think is the two different tactics of how they're using that. And that has changed tremendously, right? In terms of like the sophistication, right? Starting from very generic malware attacks to now something like mobile attacks that happened in 2019, which was like one-click attacks. And even if you look at the report of Citizen Lab, which actually talks about that we worked with Citizen Lab, it actually, the open source information that they had information about every Tibetan that was working in almost like really high level Tibetans working in the Tibetan government in exile, in the private office of His Holiness, key individuals in the Tibetan movement. They had information about who they were, what they do, their phone numbers. All of that information was available to the Chinese government to use those attacks. So it was not generic, it was very targeted. So this is something that's happening more and more. So, but I've talked about this, and I do want to talk about like a few cases that is changing the narrative or even like what's happening now. So this is the images that I have here is on Douyin, right? People speaking publicly on Douyin. These are Tibetans that are speaking publicly in Douyin. This happened around July of 2024. And the reason why this happened is like Douyin started banning Tibetan language. So earlier, like you could speak on Tibetan, you can use Douyin to speak Tibetan language and you can live stream in Tibetan, but they started kind of restricting Tibetans from speaking Tibetan. So this is what also kind of like, there was an outcry, people started speaking up about it. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is a content that they know that they can get arrested for. So that whole aspect of fear but also there is resistance. So I think this is one example of it. The second example that I want to talk about this is the delegate dam protest. So there was a dam that was being like planned for a very long time. And this was in early 2024. And people started releasing those videos on social media and sharing that globally with Tibetans in the outside space, because I think it's important to understand that when this happens, people look at it and it does have an impact of how the Tibet narrative and the Tibet consciousness and how Tibet is spoken about in the global space, right? So people are starting to share those information. This was a video that showed in 2024, in November 2024, where a boarding school, like the colonial boarding school system, right, where there was a Chinese principal beating up a Tibetan kid. And that video was leaked in social media inside Tibet, and that was shared globally and shared with the exile community. So the reason why yes, so I wanted to end here, and the reason why I talked about the sharing of these videos is something that is very recent. Like if you look at all these three examples, these are 2024. So with the whole thing about like the digital technologies, the digital repression of Tibetans inside Tibet, which is really expanding, right? It's expanding not just to like earlier it was about censoring, just kind of like political content, right? Now language, religious, and then like kind of like even trying to erase Tibetan identity through the schools and all of that. I think people are resisting. So I think this is something that I wanted to share. And yes, and if you have any questions, our website is tibetaction.net, and we have a program that's called tipster.org, where we look at like a lot of the different targeted attacks against the Tibetan community in the diaspora and all of that. And I also have a lot of the links. So I wanted to speak more about what the issue is and what the policies are aimed towards and how that is trying to change the narrative of Tibet. But if you want to look at the technical reports and all of that, I've put some of the links here, and that can be probably shared by Doman later on. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Losangla. Yes, actually, talking about human rights repression in Tibet it's difficult, not only because you might face serious consequences, but also because it's very difficult to get information about the human rights repression, whether it's about digital. So yes, it's so thank you for going through all what kind of tactics and that involve in the digital repressions and information restrictions and surveillance in Tibet. And thirdly, we have Mahesh from Nepal. Mahesh?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Hi, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the NYCU's International Center for Cultural Studies for inviting me here and letting me speak this very important topic. And it was really great to hear from all the previous speakers and learn a lot about what's really happening in the digital domain and what China is trying to do regionally, globally, and all of that. So before starting, let me just try and share my screen here so that. Okay, that's great. So my presentation is going to zoom out a little bit from the core topics that we've been discussing so far. And so I'm going to talk about the Nepal-China digital connectivity, BRI and beyond. Here, I will focus on four key areas. First, I'll talk a little about what the current trend of the Nepal-China relations are, the evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative in Nepal. Then I will go on to the Nepal-China digital connectivity. Then we'll discuss shortly about the opportunities and challenges of this connectivity cooperation. So first, when we talk about the current status of the Nepal-China relation, we see that most recently, in December 2024, we had our Prime Minister KP Oli, who visited China and signed the much anticipated and awaited framework for BRI cooperation. And that was in December 2024. It was about 7 years after the first initial MOU was signed. I think I'm pretty sure most of us are well aware of this. So what we see in the major trend in the recent years and months is that most of these engagements, and especially after the December 2024, the Prime Minister's chief political advisor also mentioned that any engagement that we're going to have from now onwards is going to be under the BRI framework. So I think that's to clarify in the beginning, because there was a lot of confusion and criticism about Chinese diplomats and authorities claiming infrastructure projects under BRI, and Nepali politicians sort of resisting to those framings. And then we see also a very a laid-back approach from China, or sort of like delay in disbursing the committed grant to Nepal. So over the years, China has committed some 109 billion Nepali rupees grant, and we see that China's preference for grant disbursement usually goes higher when we have communist governments or leftist parties in the government. But even then, if you see the pattern, there is a huge delay in disbursement of these funds. And so China sees Nepal as a transit hub in its access to the South Asian or Indian market. And they call it the Trans-Himalayan Multi-Dimensional Connectivity Network, under which we see multiple economic corridors, the proposed Nepal-China, Tibet-China railway, and a lot of other connectivity efforts under this. So we see how Nepal, being situated in this geopolitically sensitive area or location, has a lot of issues that it has to navigate successfully to not fall under this trap of geopolitical sensitivities or polarization. So we have that. And now we also see that over the years, or in recent times, China has been sort of focusing or shifting towards small yet beautiful and small yet smart projects. That's what they call it. And that's a global shift, but also we see that in Nepal, like they go and distribute bags and they do small projects in local area and local level governments, collaborating with them. And we also see the shift to soft sectors like NGOs, and we see a lot of cultural exchanges happening and student-to-student exchange. And we see all of these happening more and more with Nepal right now. And this is because of the criticism that China has received globally, issues with the debt repayment and restructuring. So China has been kind of pushing towards the sustainability or digital connectivity and local partnerships over the years. And we see that also happening in Nepal. So in talking about now BRI, we signed the MOU in 2017 in May. And in 2019, President Xi Jinping visited Nepal, and that was a very historic moment because that's when Nepal-China bilateral relationship was officially elevated to strategic partnership. And since then, we see a gradual alignment of Nepal-China strategic priorities, and that has been very apparent. And most recently in 2023, when Prime Minister Pushpa Kamal Dahal visited China, we saw that Nepal's initial stance of one China policy that transformed to, that was changed to one China principle. And most recently in 2024, we saw one step further in Nepal's commitment to China's one China principle. We saw an explicit mention of Xizang instead of Tibet. One of our speakers already mentioned how China has been trying to kind of influence its partner countries towards that. We also saw the explicit mention of, we had it, they called it, that initially we saw that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory, but this time it went one step further, and in the joint statement, it said Nepal firmly supports China's efforts to achieve its national reunification. I think that's a step further in the strategic alignment of these two countries. And in coming back to BRI, after the 2019 visit, we saw China's version of implementation plan being sent to Nepal, but there was a lot of political dissatisfaction because the implementation plan was Nepal was the only second country after Morocco with whom China wanted a separate implementation plan for the BRI cooperation. Morocco, importantly, is seen by China as a trading hub in its access to the North African market. Similarly, Nepal sits at the very important juncture of or gateway to South Asia and Indian markets. So we saw that push from China to sign a separate implementation plan. But in 2024, before Prime Minister Oli's visit, we had a massive revision of that implementation plan, and we came up with the framework for BRI cooperation that was significantly reduced from what initially seemed like a treaty-like agreement to a very simplistic BRI cooperation framework. Under this, there are revised projects. We see this. Initially, we had 9 projects. On your left, you can see, but the new one, we saw a revision of those projects. These are the 10 projects, and these projects are to be negotiated on a project-by-project basis in the future. So this is the current status of BRI in Nepal. And now I think we already talked or touched upon a lot about how the Belt and Road Initiative and its digital Silk Road, what China is trying to do in terms of its global connectivity effort. Of course, the infrastructure development, fiber optic cables, 5Gs and data centers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We've also seen efforts for the 5G expansion through Huawei and other Chinese companies. China has been also developing e-commerce platforms and digital payment systems across the world. Satellite navigation is another one. We see cybersecurity and AI cooperation under China's leadership, both multilaterally through UN agencies and UN platforms, but also bilaterally working with different countries. And so against this backdrop, if we see Nepal-China digital connectivity, we see it at a very nascent phase. We don't have like a formal, even though we have signed the Belt and Road Initiative, the digital Silk Road in Nepal is sort of in a very nascent phase. But the integration of digital connectivity or Nepal-China digital infrastructure is rapidly emerging, and it requires monitoring for its implications for society, politics, and economy. So what I try to do is I examine the joint statement from 2016 to 2024. This is important because 2015 we saw the economic blockade from India, and that sort of left a political vacuum in Nepal and sort of accelerated China's influence and presence in Nepal's politics. And so initially, China sort of favored the leftist parties and leaders for its engagement with Nepal, but it soon realized that it is important to diversify and work with all the parties. And over the years, we have seen very high-level visits, important high-level visits from both China and Nepal. Like I said, in 2016, Prime Minister Oli immediately visited China to sort of diversify Nepal's dependence on trade and economy. Then we again saw Prime Minister Oli's visit in 2018. After that, we had Nepali president's visit in 2019 to China. And then immediately after that, President Xi Jinping visited Nepal. And in 2023, we had Prime Minister Pushpakamal Dahal visit China. And then in 2024, we had Prime Minister Oli again visiting China. And as I mentioned earlier, throughout these visits and over the years, Nepal and China have sort of aligned more closely when you talk about strategic realms. And so how I try to see this very scattered and nascent digital and emerging digital connectivity between these two countries is through the joint statement and formal agreements that have been signed between the two countries. And on your right, I have mentioned a few key areas of digital connectivity that I could identify from these joint statements and agreements. The first is cross-border optical fiber, telecommunication cooperation, digital economy, infrastructure and artificial intelligence, information exchange, agreement on transit and transport, transit cargo. We also had the joint technical working group on trade and payment agreement. We'll look into this. Madan Bhandari University for Science and Technology, and then Emergency Operation Center project. So first, the cross-border optical fiber is important because we had Nepal received some 6 million US grant in 2007 to sort of develop this optical fiber through Araniko highway that connects Nepal's capital Kathmandu through it's called Lhasa to Lhasa, but this was completed in 2008. However, because of several issues, the operationalization was not done until 2018. That's when this optical fiber was expanded through the Rasuaguri trade point and border point in Geelong, or what we call Geelong. So this cross-border optical fiber expansion and connectivity with China was a major step in Nepal's effort to diversify its dependence, and it sort of ended Indian ISP's monopoly in Nepal's internet market, and it also opened new avenues for commercial partnership and trade with China. And so this is one of the key areas of digital connectivity between these two countries that is apparent. The second one is the telecommunications cooperation. Over the years, we have seen the growing role and presence of Huawei and ZTE-like companies in Nepal. In 2023 and 2024, we saw the reiteration of this this statement you can see in the red here. The two sides agreed to continue support the cooperation between telecommunication operators of the two countries and to carry out maintenance and expansion projects related to cross-border land cables. We've seen that in 2019, when CCSI and ZTE were given the contract to expand 4G in Nepal, it came under heavy criticism for not adhering to the competitive bidding process and for potential irregularity and corruption in Nepal. And there was a probe or the investigation by the Nepal's CIA, Commission for Investigation of Abuse and Authority. But when it cleared that, we saw their role even growing even more. And one thing that comes to mind is how the ZTE and Huawei technology was used without a separate, again, competitive bidding in 5G trials. And this was, again, a matter of controversy and a lot of criticism in Nepal, because not just due to the security and safety concerns that we have seen globally, but also because of the lack of competitive bidding in this one. So currently, Nepal Telecom's core network and access network, they're all dependent on Huawei technology. So we see this cooperation between telecommunications, China Telecom and Nepal Telecom, only growing further and integrating even more closely. Now, the third is digital economy, infrastructure, and artificial intelligence. In 2024, a joint statement, this was expressed very clearly, where the agreement between Ministry of Education, Science and Technology of Nepal and the Ministry of Technology of PRC in the field of science and technology was signed, and the two sides agreed to discuss cooperation in the areas such as digital economy, digital infrastructure, and artificial intelligence, among others. And from one of my research that is currently ongoing, I was looking into how many multilateral and bilateral cooperation or exchanges that Nepali government officials have had globally. And I came to know that like the 3 or 4 major AI collaboration or cooperation or conferences that Nepali authorities have attended in or participated in, they're all in China. And so we see this kind of cooperation, especially people-to-people exchange and tech transfer, sort of on an ad hoc basis, kind of increasingly happening so in between Nepal and China. So, and then this is likely to grow. For instance, when you talk about digital infrastructures, we see the dominance of Chinese surveillance technologies like Hikvision in Nepal. That is probably the most rolled surveillance cameras in Nepal, and its implications on security and privacy, it is well known. Its concerns have been raised globally. So we see that is the third key area of digital connectivity between these two countries. Now, information exchange is another important one here that has significant implications for the topics that we are discussing here today. In the 2023 joint statement, there was a mention of how the two countries should maintain and promote law enforcement cooperation, which is important for the two countries' security, as mentioned in the document. And they agreed to further strengthen information exchange and capacity building between the law enforcement institutions. So these have very important implications for, thank you, 5 more minutes. Yeah, so, and these are very important implications for Nepal when it comes to law enforcement or security practices or even human rights and freedom of expressions and privacy, data privacy, and all of that. So this collaboration or cooperation is also further expanding between these two countries. Now, another digital connectivity comes in terms of the transit and transport agreement that was signed between the two countries in 2016. This has the transit and the transport of these two countries. It involves digital systems for tracking and management, and this also signifies, or this also kind of signals how this could be, or this is emerging as an important avenue or aspect of growing digital connectivity between these two countries. Now, transit cargo in 2023, Nepal received for the first time, it received the cargo from a third country through China, and this obviously had components of digital tracking and management systems. So this is, again, like I mentioned in the earlier slide, another key avenue of digital connectivity that is expanded between these two countries. Now, Joint Technical Working Group on Trade and Payment Agreement. So the two countries have also signed an agreement or an MOU to sort of establish a working group that would modify the trade and payment agreement that was signed earlier in 2016 or 18. And under this, in May 2024, we saw another MOU between Nepal's Clearinghouse Limited and Ant International, which sort of started for the first time cross-border digital QR payment using Alipay. So we see even in the financial integration or cooperation sector, this digital connectivity between the two countries is growing. Now, Mother Bhandari University for Science and Technology, this was one of the infrastructure projects in the BRI list initially, but even also in the revised list of BRI project, this features, but there has been very little progress on this one. Now, finally, in the Emergency Operations Center projects in the China-aided Earthquake Monitoring Network project in Nepal, or in the National Emergency Operations Center, we see a growing collaboration and cooperation between the two countries when it comes to the exchange of knowledge, information, and technology, and also to information platform of these projects. So this is another key digital connectivity cooperation that is growing between the two countries. Now, I want to go on to the final point here about on the BRI cooperation framework that was signed most recently. It lists out 5 cooperation priorities here. And these are the economic cooperation, financial sector cooperation, transport connectivity and logistic cooperation, trade, industry capacity and investment cooperation, and customs cooperation. And like I mentioned earlier, the digital connectivity cooperation efforts are not very materialized or not very concrete between these two countries. And we see these are very evolving. And when we see how the two countries, of China especially, has been pushing the use of national currencies, digital payment, and we have also seen the efforts to sort of enhance the cross-border e-commerce between the two countries. And we have seen the trade and security facilitation efforts through digital connectivity. Information sharing and communication is yet another. And then we also see further strengthening telecommunication cooperation happening through the Trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network. We do have some opportunities, especially for resource-starved countries like Nepal, to sort of benefit from China's tech expertise, benefit from China's tech capital. And so through digital payment, or whether it is from the e-commerce platforms or capacity building and tech transfer, there are opportunities, but it also comes with a lot of risks and challenges, the cyber dependency and particularly in the field of data privacy and security implications of these Chinese tech, especially the surveillance technologies, is crucial and immense, especially when it comes to human rights and freedom of expression. Then also we have concerns of debt sustainability in these large infrastructure projects. Political instability in Nepal, it's also hindering the positive aspects of these cooperations. Geopolitical sensitivities we have, it also needs diversification of the digital dependence, because it has important implications for Nepal's economic growth, particularly when it comes to FDI on ICT sector. Again, like I mentioned, human rights, surveillance, data protection, these are some of the crucial issues. I didn't go much into detail because we already have talked about how China is trying to sort of export these models to other countries, especially when it comes to the BRI partners. And one of the examples is how in the Nepal's national cybersecurity policy, the national internet gateway was inserted, and that created a lot of criticism in Nepal, like also in Cambodia. So I think I will stop there because I think my time is also up. And thank you very much for your attention. And I would love to have questions if they come up later.
Okay. Thank you, Mahesh. When it comes to China and Nepal relations, especially in the context of BRI, there are two primary aspects. One is like infrastructure development. One is digital connectivity that is evolving. And there are a lot of research that is published, particularly by your Center on Infrastructure Development Corporation, but very less is talked about digital. So I'm very thankful for you to today talk extensively, not just giving us so much information, but analysis about the status of China-Nepal cooperation in terms of digital governance or infrastructure and capacity building. So last time when I was in Nepal in November, I saw like two Huawei and ZTE has built two the most beautiful and the largest building in Nepal. So in that case, and then also when I met few reporter, they said it's very difficult to do anything report about China. That's not because they are scared of Chinese government detention, but more concerned about the constraints in the financial resources that come from the government. So yes, so thank you so much for participating and giving us so much information and analysis about the China and Nepal cooperation on digital infrastructure and its implication. So last but not least, we have Howard in his English name. And so yes, over to you, Howard. I think he has lost. Hello.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Doma. Thank
no,
you.
No. Hi, I cannot see your PowerPoint.
Okay, let me give me a few minutes. Sorry about that. Okay. Oops. Let me see. Is it okay now?
No, I cannot see. Or should I ask? Because you have said ask.
Okay. So
Okay.
okay, I'm sorry about it. Yeah, I'm Howard. I'm from Hong Kong and now located in Taiwan. I am previous work in a legislative assistant for a pro-democracy lawmaker in Hong Kong. I'm sharing the current situation about how China digital governance erode the human rights and freedoms in Hong Kong. And my presentation will divide into several parts. The first section, I will explain how the laws imposed in Hong Kong restrict the digital freedom and also the non-legal methods used to target the civil society. And second part, I will discuss a broader impact on the society, including the business sector, media, and also the general public. Finally, I will share my concern about how the China's suppression on digital freedom in Hong Kong could affect the wide global impact in potential influence in the other region and countries. So let's begin. And since the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong in 2020, the freedom previously protected under the one country two system framework are significantly eroded. Aligning Hong Kong political landscape increasing with the mainland China. Essentially, the Hong Kong government has been seen as acting under the direct instruction from Beijing to suppress the freedom in Hong Kong. This law pushed Hong Kong's digital governance close to China's authoritarian models, eroding free speech and human rights through the fake legal language or civil penalties. I'd like to mention the national security law, which is I think this is most crucial part of the legal framework that affects the digital governance and also the civil society in Hong Kong now. That this law is enacted by the China government in 2020. It significantly impacts the internet freedom and follow increasing the restrictions on internet openness since the embedded movement, marking by the censorship and also the online surveillance. The NSL, along with the other security law, which calls Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, has progressively aligned Hong Kong's internet regulation with China's restrictive model. A key example is that the court injunction against the protest album, The Glory to Hong Kong, initially rejected due to concern over its chilling effects, but later granted by the court appeal in 2024. Although the injunction allowed limited use by the journalists and also for the academic use, but the platform like YouTube, Google need to block or remove the album on the platform, demonstrating the expanding online restriction. It highlights the need of reassess internet freedom risk under the NSL legislations. And also the other important law is the SNSO, the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, which is the enacted in 2024, which is sweeping power that significantly expands the Hong Kong digital control. It criminalizes acting the so-called endangering national security related with the electronic system with the fact definition and harsh 20 years person's penalty. The law was designed to bypass the previous court ruling limiting the use of the computer-related offense. Worryingly, it also has extraterritorial reach and could target the encrypted communication platform, mirroring the China's digital security practice. The shift has already led to corporate risk mitigations, such as restricted the database access and also the use of burner phones by some of international firms because did not want to avoid the legal burden. We can see that the NS law and also the SNSOs has significantly impacted the digital rights in Hong Kong. Firstly, they restricted digital expressions and by the expanding content censorship, including the blocking protest songs and other critical online posts, fear the legal consequences has driven a widespread self-censorship among the society. Secondly, personal privacy and also the data security are under threat. The SNSO could undermine the encryption technology, weakening the private communication safeguards, while also empowering police to demand the user data from the internet service provider without the court warrants. Thirdly, the civil society and the press also suffer from this. The NSL has been used to shut down the internet independent media outlets, while the SNSO further frightened the journalists and also the whistleblower to risk the persecutions for the referring government's misconduct. Lately, this law have and international implications. Their extraterritorial reach could pressure the global companies, global business into the self-censorship and to avoid the violating the Hong Kong's regulation. Beyond the national security law and also the SNSO, the Hong Kong government also employed the other legislative and administrative measures to curb the dissent in Hong Kong. I will focus on 2 to 3 law, which is showing that the measures provide a broad censorship powers. One of these is the Protection of Critical Infrastructure Bill, introduced by the government in 2024, claimed to enhance the cybersecurity for critical infrastructure such as energy, data, telecommunication, and financial institutions. The bill proposed 5 new criminal offenses, including the illegal data access, data interceptions, and also the interference with the computer system. The government justified the law is necessary for the public. Of course, they claim so, and also protect the national security. But these provisions and also the extensive of government power raising a significant concern about threatening the civil and digital rights. The bill could allow the authority to install the software and access the private computer system, undermining the data integrity and security. It also introduced a 12 hours reporting window for cybersecurity bench, placed under pressure to those business sector to report the incidents. Additionally, the law's extraterritorial reach could impact the global data protection norms, putting the business sector need to share the cross-border data to the government. It is violated the international private standard. The civil society also served the risk under these legislations. The billboard language could lead to charge against the activists and also the civil organization to misuse the cybersecurity as a reason and fighting the freedom of expressions. And the business also need to voice to share those sensitive user data to the government. It raised the concern will exposing the individuals to potential surveillance. And the other important law is anti-doping law in Hong Kong. This passing an amendment in 2020 was introduced following a court injunction aimed at preventing unauthorized disclosure for personal information online. The government claimed the law is also claimed that necessary to safeguard privacy and criminalized by sharing the personal data, particularly harass of harmful to the police officer during the protest a few years ago. The penalty are served during the fines up to $1 million and imprisonment up to 5 years. The Privacy Commissioner also granted extensive power to including the authority to order content removal even from the overseas online platform. And the legislation, of course, raising the significant concerns about the impact of society, and the authority, the government cited that needs to prevent the doxing of the police officer and officials. But we can see that the law has selective enforcement. Notably, some of the government figures receive the protection under this law. But on the other hand, the protester and also the pro-democratic activists has been disproportionately targeted. I will mention this situation later. And the selective enforcement undermine of this the rule of law applying to the protection unequally and weakening the public trust of in the legal institutions. By the individual case, the law's broad definition and also prosecution create a chilling effect on free speech as activists, journalists, and business will censor to avoid the prosecutions. And the government grants a lot of power to demand the content to remove the information in the online platform, even in the foreign forum. And also, additional to the newly passed law, the Hong Kong government also implements the outdated colonial legislation unenforced many years, but now target to prosecute to our common citizens. The governments reinterpreted this colonial law, and seditional law is is enacted in 1971. This is few decades ago, and you can see that this guy in the picture, he was the acting chief editor of Standard News. Standard News, which is the most influential online media in Hong Kong a few years ago. He was arrested after the media was forced to disband. The law, the sedition law is revived in recent years and prosecuted online speech and so-called threatening to the national security. The people has been charged under this law for their online posts. While the government claims these actions are protesting the national security, the reality is this law target and suppressing the freedom expression, such the case like the Standard News. The chief harm to society also voiced by business, especially from the information and communications and technology company, to comply with the stricter monitoring and censorship requirements, potentially compromising the user data privacy and share it to the government. The government could face legal demand to use this information and creating a difficult balance between the privacy and also the legal pressure. The broader implications of this law are concerning. They foster the fear and self-censorship and also threatened for the expressing of political view. And furthermore, after the passages of the national security legislation, the charge of the seditions have been expanded, including offenses such as treason to the country. The expansion increased the pressure to our citizens and also to the business sector and NGOs. This law undermined the autonomy of our civil society. And also there is the other law is date back from the colonial era. This is the Emergency Regulation Ordinance that date back to 1922. It gave the government power to control the internet and suppress the communications. Even though the ordinance are not of active use in recent years, but it remains a part of legal framework and involved in the current years. The law potentially allows the government to block messaging apps and also the social media sites, which is important to the civil society. And the government also claims that is for maintain the public order. But the impact is significant. The business may also need to share those personal personal user data and to the government and put the user privacy at risk. So it's also create a chilling effect in Hong Kong. After the legislation, I will share some kind of the non-legislative measure that is affecting the government implement in the current years. In September 2022, the government introduced this legislation of the SIM card regulations, mandating the real name registration of all SIM cards. The officials signed the crime prevention and say that the measure is significant for to so-called this to protect our citizens from so-called misuse of the technology. The administrative order has expanded government's power to bypass the judicial oversight. The police can have all the authority to demand the user data from the social provider without court approval, and also increasing the investment to advanced surveillance technology, including the AI power monitoring system, raising a serious concern about the mass data collection to, and also to the erosion of the privacy. And the AI technology in Hong Kong advancement is reshaping the digital freedom and also raise the concern about information control. The government is developing its own ChatGPT style AI tool, and for the civil service use for monitoring the online spaces. And it framed as efficiency measures and involve locally developed database and language model. It could influence the public discourse and also the information access, and helping the government to more focus on the to the local issue and also for the speech freedom of speech of our people. And also the pro-China groups involvement also play an important in Hong Kong's heavily controlled political environment. the pro-government groups have become a special class beyond the legal accountability. They can target the pro-democracy activists without facing the same legal consequence. And the China government and also the Hong Kong officials benefit from their violations. The key example is this pro-China group, which is called Hong Kong League Campaign in 2019, which is a network of the website and social media channel to expose the personal information of the pro-democracy activists, the journalists, and also the protesters. These platforms are claimed won by the local volunteers, but we can think that this is operation have a largely coordination by the professional actor that is related with the state interests of China. The campaign violates the activists' rights of privacy and security, and also frighten our people to afraid to post and speak on the online platform. And of course, this is one of the internet doxings, but the office showed and Hong Kong government treat it unequally and enabling the further attacks to the pro-democracy voices. Now is the second part that is related to the business sector. We can see that the business sector play an important role on it and have a strong influence on the digital rights debate. And for the companies cooperating in Hong Kong, especially in the technical sector, the evolving regulatory landscape poses the significant changes. The firm must continually reassess the compliance strategies, implements the data protection measure, meeting the local legal needs and also the global standards, and develop a flexible operation model to adapt the legal change. The self-censorship also echoed how the companies firm in China often adopt a more conservative practice than Beijing's requirement. Similarly, the business in Hong Kong are also face the risks of the non-compliance. The evolving legal landscape in Hong Kong, particularly after the NSL, present a significant risk for the international business. The law language means the companies may face the liability for the content removal. And the key components challenge, including the data localization, the companies face to pressure to store the user data locally and increasing the cost and also the private risk. Social media platform also struggle with the content modernization due to the NSO implementations, often over censor to avoid the penalty. The operational vulnerability further complicates the business developments. This includes the data access conflict, the financial sector strength to the conflict regulations, supply chains disrupt from the increasing inspections, and these uncertainties undermine the Hong Kong reliability as a business center, deterring the investment and also steering the operation for the global business. The Hong Kong government use the legal tools to suppress the press freedoms go far beyond the law themselves. The selective enforce legislation and also amplify the high-profile prosecutions. Authority creates a chilling effect where the self-censorship becomes widespread. Media outlets unsure where the so-called red line is. For example, the Nikkei analysis refers a 40% drop in the face Hong Kong people in editorial after the introduction of national security law in 2020, despite no direct action taken against these outlets at the time. The climate of the fear has also led to the closure to the media organizations. One example is the Radio Free Asia shutdown in Hong Kong's branch, citing the safety concern linked to expanding the national security law and also the NSSO. The disclosure not only limited the local press diversity, but also forced the RFA to relocate their staff to US, Taiwan, or the other country, highlighting the press freedom under the Beijing influence. Is it so that this pattern insult the press freedom in Hong Kong? And there is two of the cases that is related with the prosecution in the current years, and this is Mika Yun arrest in Hong Kong after she returning from Japan in 2023, and because he making a social media post for promoting for Hong Kong independence, but despite for having a small social media following, he just had few hundreds Facebook friends and also follower in IG. He was sentenced for 2 months in prison after he come back to Hong Kong and sent a chilling message for many Hong Kongers to, even they stay studying or working in a foreign country, facing the prosecution after they come back to Hong Kong. And there is the other cases, that is the member of the League of the Social Democrats, Chow Kim Ho, and he is public some slogans on Facebook and also in IG, just like Liberate Hong Kong and support for Taiwan independence. But later, the prosecution requested delays of the further investigations and citing that the additional charge to him. And the court also denied his bail application because say that there is remained from action from endanger the further national security. Yeah, we can see that there are also the other cases that is related to, even though it is not related with the politics, it is just some of the Facebook group is concerned about the culture of the store, but it need to rename it to be the Hong Kong Retail News concern group, because for the self-censorship, the admin say that to avoid the political pressure and to take up the social responsibility and no need to voice the prosecution from the government. So we can see that there is a lot of the measure of tools that used by the government to control the civil and digital freedoms nowadays in Hong Kong. Thank you, Doma.
Okay, thank you, Howard, for your presentations and taking us through how the Chinese government digital governance and surveillance and also securitizations worked in Hong Kong through the implementation of various kinds of law. So now we will open the discussions. So anyone who has a question, they can raise their hand and directly ask the speaker. Any questions from the audience?
Maybe I would like to raise a question. So, Doma, that would be okay?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes, sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you all so much for your intervention, your observations and your analysis. That's really important for us because this is a rapidly growing and spreading phenomenon. I specifically would like to raise a question for Michael. I know that you've been doing a lot of research in this on this topic, and I think that the challenge that's facing us in today in the 21st century is that, as you said, that the new model or mode of governance, it's really taking effect. It seems that there's no limit for the territory because of the digital platform, digital connectivity. And so that there's also no limit of the power that's penetrating. We are not only talking about long-arm jurisdiction, but this long-arm jurisdiction is so effective with this digital surveillance system. And so the penetrating capacity of the government, I think this the discourse of this 天下 model is really effective because there is no outside. It's all inclusive guardianship. And I wonder, but my other observation is that technology seduced local government to comply and also to execute their own authoritarian control on their own people. So it is not only China's controlling all the world. Of course it is, I mean, in many ways. But the counterpart, that is the receiving country, also exercises their potential or capacity to control their own people. You have done cases with Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, right? Southeast Asian countries. Do you notice this nature of this local government in that respect? And what would be the next step for you? I mean, we're all talking about human rights, right? But now there's no law. There's no domestic law or international law to intervene or to protect this in terms of basic human right for many threatened population. So maybe I think that concerns everyone, every speaker today. But Michael, do you want to say a few more about this?
Sure, Joyce, thank you for the question. I'll try to be brief and then also make time for others who want to jump in on the same question. I mean, you raised a lot of, I think, really valid and complicated questions, right? Because I mean, these are the, the $1 million questions, right, as they say. And I mean, a whole other conversation I think can be had about, strategies for responding to, the challenges that we've all laid out. I mean, I think, one thing, you're absolutely right. It's reductive to say that China is forcing the adoption of some of these technologies or norms on the countries that are embracing digital authoritarianism, where we see this rise of digital authoritarianism. I mean, it's happening in tandem with, global indicators that show that democracy is in decline around the world. And so, I mean, obviously, while China is a particularly malign, like global threat actor in providing, the tools, the technologies, the normative frameworks, they're doing it for, where it's being adopted, it's countries that are already obviously very receptive to a more authoritarian, closed approach to governance. And so we can't talk about the bilateral relationship between, say, China and Thailand, or China and Nepal, or Vietnam, or Tanzania or Ecuador in a vacuum. Obviously, there's a lot of other, all of the various other complex geopolitical situation and what's happening in the purported champions of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and transparency. And so, and sadly, what we're also seeing is, an embrace of popularism, nationalism in a lot of the, again, ostensibly democratic rule of law countries in Europe, North America, other parts of Asia, Latin America, Africa, right? But, and so it is a challenge because, as I tried to point out in my presentation, there is a distinct need for digital development, right? Like connectivity, developing infrastructure in the underdeveloped parts of the world. China's filling a gap in that regard. What we also need to ensure that alternatives that provide the digital development needs are there, are affordable, are accessible, and that are ensuring that they're promoting the rights-based approach. One, I think, counterproductive narrative that we see a lot is companies and countries that say, well, if not us, then China. And so we're going to bend our values, we're going to bend our principles. It's better for Apple, or it's better for some random Canadian or Swedish company to be involved in building out the infrastructure in a country that might still use that infrastructure to surveil and repress its populations. At least it's us and it's not China. But at the end of the day, repression is repression. And so I think we also need to push back on these narratives that, because yes, China is a prevailing malign threat actor, but just to say, if not China, then us, it's better. At the end of the day, if it's empowering human rights abuses, this is what we need to be pushing back on also. So we need to ensure the universality of human rights throughout all internet governance, digital governance, development needs. And this calls for ensuring transparency by design, transparency in procurement processes. We need to push back on the export of certain dual-use technologies that we see that might have some, more benign commercial uses, but also have very serious surveillance or repressive capabilities. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for, yes, the deleterious role that U.S. tech companies play, that other tech companies are also playing in, the surveillance capitalist model, and also it's a complex web. And I think you're right to say that it's not just that, China comes along and pushes everyone to adopt these things. I mean, what we need to do at the same time of, unpacking and identifying the complexity of the, grossly human rights, non-compliant, alternative digital governance norms that China's pushing, is to ensure the universality of human rights. Well, we need to be engaging in like global, I mean, it's a global struggle to ensure that these rights, these norms, these freedoms are being, upheld, everywhere through all collaboration agreements, cooperations, and so forth. So, I mean, it's a very complex question that you asked, that I think the point here obviously was, I mean, we're talking about one actor, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think that, this is why it's good that there are multi-stakeholder forums like RightsCon, which is coming up next month in Taiwan, like the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum, the Summit for Democracies, perhaps. I mean, ensuring that civil society, independent companies, stakeholders beyond states increasingly and continually have an equal role and presence in the internet governance discussions, standard setting bodies, more civil society, more multi-stakeholder participation at the International Telecommunications Union, other standard development organizations, for example, because while states like China are pushing this rights non-compliant approach to governance, we need to ensure that at the same fora where international standards are being discussed, the UN and others, that there's a robust, effective participation from civil society in particular and other stakeholders as well. I think our other speakers mentioned briefly some of the like cybersecurity, cybercrime norm setting at the UN Cybercrime Convention that has been ongoing in negotiation for the last several years, initially sponsored by Russia, China, Cambodia, Myanmar, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. I mean, countries that have a track record of abusing the human rights and fundamental freedoms of their people, supported this convention. It was finally agreed to. The signing ceremony for this convention will take place in Vietnam this year. And I mean, this is one example where, frankly, like the human rights narrative is losing against the more digital authoritarian model, because now we have a UN cybercrime convention that is normalizing a lot of these really repressive approaches to dealing with some legitimate cybercrime issues where people are being exploited and abused and taken advantage of, but encapsulating that within, again, this sort of security and development narrative. And unfortunately, as Article 19 and others have put out in our analyses of the Cybercrime Convention, it's a blueprint for human rights abuses, for example, in creating opening for greater surveillance, cross-border sharing of information between law enforcement agencies, and it risks, especially in the hands of states that are wont to abuse these types of norms, greater digital transnational repression and others. So it's a complex task, obviously, I think ahead of us. I don't know if I answered your question or just kind of went off on a tangent.
Yeah,
but...
sure. This is actually a very tough situation and tough question, of course, I know. But I also looked into the cases of the scam, crime, and so on. So that's obvious that we need international intervention. But how about this, for example, situation in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or not Tibet yet, but I hope Tibet. Not Nepal yet, but I hope Nepal will not turn into another Hong Kong at some time. The film, I think maybe most of you have watched, Total Trust. This is the documentary of this how under this huge massive surveillance system, everyone can report anybody else, and so this that's horrible. But for example, like in Hong Kong or in China, the law, human rights lawyer, they could all be arrested, or this publisher, they can be arrested with no real reason, right? So, but how do they get caught? It's because of this digital connectivity, and so that they expose their rightful words, but they can be arrested. So the local government would not really how do we think of local resistance? We are talking about local resistance, local civil societies resilience to take counter action. But how is it possible? Maybe Howard can also share something, some knowledge or some thoughts for us.
It's okay to hear my voice.
Yes, clear.
I think it's quite difficult for us is because the self-censorship is quite serious in Hong Kong nowadays. And for example, some people may call the national security hotline to give those information to the authority, and also even in some chat groups on Facebook or on Telegrams, we call them spy. We call them ghost. They are spy from the police sections, the national security section. So they monitor the poses on this forum, and of course, as I mentioned, there has advanced AI tool to help the authority to have more focus on this information, the wordings that is so-called touching the red line. Is really difficult. It's because most of the people in Hong Kong now are not trust the others to talk about something that is related to the politics or the public informations, even though friends will not share their political opinion in their friendly circle. So I think this is very difficult and serious situation now. Maybe I think that the control of the infrastructure also the much more important, because as Michael mentions, these kinds of the infrastructure control are not just applied in Hong Kong, it also applies in more Southeast Asian countries. And I'm afraid that the China government will build an inter-border data connection system, and also with the other authoritarian regime in our countries. So I think this is not only frightened from the protestants related with China issue, but also they become a firm alliance on the international level.
Yeah. Or even diaspora of Hong Kong in Taiwan might not be safe. In UK might not be safe. In other places might not be safe, right? Not to mention the data could be collected. So we are really facing a huge challenge. I don't know if Roma, back
Sorry.
to you.
Yeah, I was just going to add a few, just share a few comments. And I really echo what Michael said earlier about thinking about this not as if you think about 10, 15, 20 years ago in terms of human rights and all of that, China used to be an outlier, right? And I think that is changing a lot, right? Whether it's with working with different partners, and the narrative about China is bad and the West is good. And I think that narrative is also really challenging to think about it, because sometimes we do have that narrative of okay, is China forcing? And I think Michael really attuned to it. It's not only about forcing, right? It's about power. And a lot of these countries, democratic countries, do want power, right? Politicians want power. So there's a lot of aspects of how power is being in the guise of securitization, right? Guise of security narrative, right? That whole thing about how do you kind of get more power. And China provides that alternative, right? China provides that avenue. And when that avenue is being provided, the question then becomes are these governments, are these individuals being held accountable in an international setting, right? And the sad thing, it is not. When certain corporations tend to work on these issues, right? Certain corporations support a lot of the surveillance industries, right? Holding them accountable is a challenge, because it's not something that's very focused in China. It's a global issue. So I think there's so many different elements of it that we really need to think about and as Joyce, you said, right? How do you build the people movement, right? How do you build the grassroots movement in terms of even a cultural understanding of what is surveillance, right? If you think about the security narrative, right? And I'm not talking about China. If you look at a lot of other countries, right? When there's a lot of CCTVs, people feel safer. People are like, oh, we want more CCTVs. We want more surveillance because we want to be safe, right? But that's the narrative that's being pushed globally. And so how do you change that narrative, right? And how do you hold these, even if there's CCTVs, right? How do you have those methods of control and access that is rights respecting? So I think those are certain norms that are being lost and that are not being developed. And a lot of democratic countries are also not really interested in developing these narratives or these norms, because it doesn't allow them to have more control. So I think that is where the challenge is, right? And I echo what Howard was saying and what you were saying, right? It is very challenging. And because at the end of the day, it is all about control, right? And it doesn't really matter. And from a Tibetan perspective, it really matters what China is doing. But from a global citizen, right, it's not just about Tibet. It's about the global narrative of how things are being changed at such a level that people really don't think about how a lot of these things are being used for surveillance, and how you're giving more and more power to corporations, governments, in the name of privacy, in the name of security. So yeah, I just wanted to echo that. And it's not just an easy solution, but I just wanted to echo that.
Yeah. The most scary thing, maybe I might, I just want one more word. The most scary thing is that law is in the hands of the power holder. So law paved the way to the total control. Yeah, back to you, Mahat.
Yeah, no, I was trying to add a little bit of different, or maybe kind of complementary insights into what our speakers already spoke, and especially when it comes to countries like Nepal that are resource deprived and that are with capacity, like, so I think it's also about the capacity of the recipient countries, like Nepal, for instance. So we can talk about different layered explanation of, for instance, the political circle. So there's little political will because they're too engrossed in political games most of the times. Bureaucracy, it's too slow to understand the evolving dynamics and too slow to fully actually grasp the overall implication of such digital integration or digital advancements and the integration that's happening. And so you see there is a big gap between the state and the people, especially when it also comes to the when it comes to sort of bridging the gap between technology and society. So what is happening, we see in Nepal, is sort of a more comprehensive effort from China for elite capture in a way. So through all these people-to-people exchanges, you see students studying in large numbers. China provides 400 scholarships every year to Nepali students. We see a large number of politicians flocking to China. We see a large number of journalists always on some sort of trips to China. So through all of these, you see a massive effort to capture the elites and what they speak and what they write about, what they talk about. You see that kind of this nuanced narrative, it's missing. And so that's when I also sort of touched upon the policy integration or policy harmonization, they call it, is an important feature of the BRI cooperation. And so for countries like Nepal whose capacity is not already strong enough, for them it's all boiling down to, what is China giving us in terms of monetary support, in terms of infrastructure assistance, and in return, whatever China pushes, or in regulatory frameworks, or whether it is some sort of digital infrastructure, that's all welcome. So because we just don't understand the nuances, or maybe we are just too busy focusing on other things. So I think there is a very important need to sort of intervene through research, through dissemination, and through knowledge sharing, especially among the grassroots. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, any other questions? No, maybe I can ask questions to Lobsang, Mahesh, and even Howard. For Lobsang, I am wondering, based on recent the Chinese government control over media, especially in the recent earthquake that happened in Tingri. So even somewhere it exposed the situation for Tibetan social media are a very important platform to raise their voice, not just about criticizing government, but even like what is happening at the ground level, But for Chinese government, it has become an important mechanism to control. So there are a lot of things, the people wanted to, even it's not about politics, even about reporting about like situations, the damage that has happened because of the earthquake. It's become a sensitive for the government, and therefore they are not able to even report that. So so I'm wondering how, so this is, I believe that my understanding is that this is not just about about the earthquake that happened, but it is happening before that, this kind of. So how do Tibetan sort of try to, try to maintain a balance, So now it has become a situation is such that you are not able to, earlier, as long as you don't talk about politics, it's okay. But now it's looked like everything is political.
Yes.
So it's become a very difficult situation. So I'm wondering, so like how they manage, balance, maintain or manage to still give some information, you know. And question to Mahesh is more about, you know, when it comes to China and Nepal digital cooperation, yes, it has been happening for last like 7 or 8. There are so many cooperation that is going on, you know, agreement that's signed. But if you look at the surface level, you look like it's not much happening. You know, there's not really happening much. But if you really go into the society, then talk people, then there are a lot of things happening. All right. So I wanted to ask, like, it's actually just like if you just look at the report, and it looks like nothing is much happening. But if you go, I believe that there are a lot of things happening. So that, and then there's a report about like Huawei, and that it's not just providing 5G or 4G internet technology, but maintaining a dominant control over the core system of Nepal Telecom and NSIL. So it does raise a very like serious questions about the whole digital security. So I'm just wondering your comments on this. And also, the last time when I visit, you know, Tibetan, not really a Tibetan majority area, the Bodha, which is not only where the Tibetans reside, but there are a lot of Chinese tourists are also coming there, and also many Tibetan who are coming to Nepal for you know, pilgrimage are also residing there. So I heard that I have seen like so many CCTV camera. So people said it's the one of the most surveillance area in Nepal, and not just surveillance. These surveillance camera are a gift from the Chinese government. In fact, one mentioned like, you know, people from the Chinese government have come to install the CCTV camera. So I'm wondering, is this like really the most like surveillance area? And also another area is Tamil. It's tourist again area. So I want your comments about this. And Howard, for my question is, I'm wondering, you have left many of, especially Hong Kong dissidents have left their home place. They have left Hong Kong and then moved to either like England or Taiwan. But many have come alone without their family. So your family are separated, but you, like, how do you maintain like communication with your family? Like you have come because of the digital so much surveillance that is going on, you know, it's become very difficult to maintain even contact with your like near one and dear one in Hong Kong, right? So I wanted to have your comment on this. And also regarding the Tibetan issue, the WeChat is the one very common app that is used to maintain connection with the family in Tibet. But at the same time, a few years ago, what happened is WeChat is not only about maintaining communication with your family, but many of Tibetans who have come to India, they are also dependent on financial support from their parents. So these financial transactions are made through the WeChat. So somewhere, I think few years ago, the government, I think Indian government or Chinese government have blocked this something. So it's so to control the voices. I guess it's from Chinese government. So this has a huge impact on the socio-economic, not just about the freedom of speech, but socio-economic aspect of the Tibetan in exile who are dependent on their parents in Tibet for financial support. Yes.
So based on time, I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. So with regards to Tingri and like, especially with the earthquake, right? So the playbook that has been followed is very similar to the traditional playbook, which is like what is allowed or not, the red line or the line where people are not supposed to cross is very vague. And that is something that the Chinese government has always done, right? So traditionally, we used to talk about what is possible, like, which is like, okay, you can't talk about politics, you can't talk about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you can't talk about the exile government. So these things are kind of like big no-nos, right? But the rest has changed. And as I said in my presentation, right, there's this whole thing about like those public awareness campaigns about what is the rumor mongering, what is disinformation. So a lot of these things are used, especially in the case of Dingri, right? If you look at Dingri and what happened with the earthquake, within the first few hours, a lot of information came across on social media, right? On Kuaishou and on Douyin of Tibetans, like, oh, this is happening in Dingri, we are going there, we're going to go and support Tibetans there. And then like within a day or two, that started disappearing because like what did happen was like people were talking about like, oh, there's a problem in this area. The rescue team hasn't reached that area. So now what that comes into play is like, okay, is that information sharing or is that rumor mongering? So then they started like, oh, like we couldn't go there, right? And then the Chinese government came out with this statement, right, where it was like, okay, if you're a group that wants to work there, you have to get a sanction, you have to do this, and like there's some technical elements to that, right? So they started doing that, and then like when people were talking about what was happening and like the sad situation in Tingri of like the people who are being impacted by the earthquake, they were all like, oh, you cannot talk about that because this is showing a negative portrayal of China. So I think those are the aspects that have always been used. And the moment, and because of the fact that like all these structures are already in place, right? The repression structures, the surveillance structures, the censorship structures, all of that are already in place. Like if you're using Chinese accounts, everything is linked to who you are. They know where you are. They know what account you're using. They have automated ways of controlling all of that. So a lot of that structure is already built in place. So that is where the narrative is, right? So it's all about like controlling the narrative. And at the same time, because of this, you can see, and I didn't talk about it in my presentation because I didn't want to focus on Tingri at the beginning because it's still happening. But you can see people are resisting. There are like more and more videos coming out, especially of the earthquake, and especially where they are like, oh, the rescue team hasn't reached this area, or there are issues there. So, but it also shows the inadequacy of a state, right? And that is not saying that, oh, China is doing this on purpose. This is something that happens with any national disaster, right? There's always going to be inadequacies in certain areas, but the Chinese government, they don't want that, right? So this is how this is being propagated. And I think, as I said earlier, the controls have already been in place, right? The fear, the self-censorship, and you may have seen one video of a very young Tibetan saying, please don't ask me any more questions because I don't like to lie. So I can't say anything. So he came out with a video, that was it. And then he stopped doing live streaming, right? So I think this is part of the control system.
I think I can jump in now, and I'll keep it short. So yeah, you're right. The digital cooperation thing is very fragmented, very dispersed, and very difficult to sort of keep a track of what's really happening. Most of it is led by the Chinese government or the Chinese companies, and based on their specific interests. This is because of a few factors. First, I think it's because the Nepali politicians' obsession with big infrastructure projects like Nepal-China railway and these big tunnels and whatnot. So mostly visible projects, and especially when it comes to it, they're always targeting their own constituency. So very politicized sort of financial and economic assistance seeking kind of behavior from Nepali politicians. That's why we don't see like a very comprehensive Nepal-China G2G level, like big thing going on there. So I think there's one that, and then I talked to some authorities, and I also noticed a trend, and I think it's very true to a great extent, that most of the Chinese technology, and I'm talking about the Huawei and ZTE dominance in Nepal, it's frankly, it's cheaper than the international competitors. So for instance, if a French or if a European or American company comes and wants to work in Nepal, and compare that with the Chinese companies wanting to work in Nepal. So from the cost point of view, it's cheaper, yeah. From proximity, it's closer, yeah. And then from dominance and presence of these Chinese companies, you see like they're here in Nepal, like you mentioned, like they're big companies. So they're here, and they're very inside the ecosystem. So like what's really happening is we don't also like Nepal does not have a dedicated cybersecurity or digital monitoring authority here. So what's happening, nobody really knows. And we also notice a Chinese approach to working with foreign governments, especially in Nepal. It's very localized, so they tend to seek some sort of collaboration or MOUs and agreements with local level governments. So a lot of these things that are happening, they, especially in countries like Nepal, they skip the like topmost level monitoring. Yeah, so they sign a sister city agreement with a small town, and then they start working there. So it kind of escapes the scrutiny of the larger body. So even there's that. And like talking about the Bauda area and the Tamil area, I think it's about the narrative that you mentioned earlier, the security, digital camera or surveillance camera, these are for security. So for the people there, or for the local governments there, or the local bodies there, if China comes and gives, we are going to gift you 100 cameras, we'll install it, we will bring our own technicians, they'll be, yeah, that's fantastic, please do. And that's the kind of narrative that we are working with. Yeah, and so I see someone in the chat saying Hikvision and are doing good business in Europe. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, that Hikvision is one of the most dominant surveillance cameras in Nepal also. So like a lot of factors, and we don't have a very centralized monitoring system, or like even you said, research that's going on here. Not even from media, because as I mentioned earlier, there's some sort of either self-censorship or some sort of like maybe even lack of understanding about the bigger implications of these developments. It's very gradual, very slow, and very invisible, so to say. And so I think it's multiple and layered factors at play here. And I think I'll keep my comment to that. I hope I answered your questions.
Okay, thank you, Thomas' questions. And fortunately, after the protests in 2019, most of the Hong Kong people noticed that they need to use the most safer way to communicate with each other. For example, Signal is becoming the most popular app that's amongst the activists and all, even the common citizens. We consistently know that the China's controlling our information in the digital space. Compared with the Taiwanese or Malaysians, I think that the people in Taiwan or Malaysia, their pattern of online communication usage are much closer with China than Hong Kongers, than Hong Kong people. So I think this is we can have some tactics to protect our privacy. But on the other hand, we are still facing a difficult situation is because, as I mentioned it, the case of Mika Yun, who was a student who studied in Tokyo University, her political opinion are still monitored by the National Security Police branch in Hong Kong. And after she go back to Hong Kong, she arrested by the National Security Police. So and even though many of the Western countries do not think that this is important issue to protect its infrastructure and also the digital security of their country. For example, the UK government is still open its market, telecommunication market, to the Chinese company. So we are worried about that. We are worried about that. And most of even though the overseas diaspora Hong Kong have self-censorship among the communities. So I think it is not easy job to because of the Beijing controls the infrastructure sector in the current years.
Okay, any question?
Is there any way to devise a counter monitoring digital tech medium to protect people? For example, like Howard just mentioned, the signal, but are there other ways, other apps or other communication technology that can counteract the state surveillance system? I don't know.
I mean, like, I can just give you a quick, because we work a lot on like combating state surveillance, right, for Tibet, inside Tibet. I think one of the things that is really important to understand, with, especially with China, is the fact that there's no really silver bullet. And I think one of the things that is part of our process is just making sure that we understand what the threats are, and like for different threat models, right, what you use, right? So for example, signal is great, right, if you trust the telecom. So in terms of Hong Kong, I would think about like, do you trust the Chinese, the Hong Kong telecom to protect you, like for signal? So there is a question there. So similar to WhatsApp, right? So I think you have to think about that. Like, so especially with regards to China, it's like, do you trust the app, or do you trust something that's not an app-based communication tool, right? Do you want to use something that's more ephemeral? Do you want to use something that's more anonymous? Do you want use something that doesn't rely on you to have connected with your phone number, right? So I think there's so many different aspects of that I think provides certain ways of like mitigating some of the surveillance tactics. But at the end of the day, I think it also is also about whether you're within the country or outside the country. That also plays into like the larger threat modeling. But what is also, I think, scary is like how that threat model or that kind of like way of doing surveillance, when it is being exported, right, and how that will also impact you globally. So we may be thinking about, okay, I'm living somewhere else, right, and the strong arms of China would not impact me, but if certain technologies like CCTVs that have access, like as Joma said, in Nepal, how does that impact a Tibetan living in Nepal? Or if Hikvision, right, which is, I think, has about 40% of the market in India, like even though it's technically called Brahma Hikvision, so they have subdivided it or something. So I don't know how the configuration works. But if that is in India, how does that impact Indians living in India who may be working on issues that are related to things that the Chinese government doesn't like, right? So I think those are certain elements of that. So, but I don't think there's any like one bullet solution or something that will allow us to kind of like mitigate a lot of these threats. But yeah.
I guess we don't have any more questions, but can I ask one last quick questions about maybe probably Michael and Lobsang can answer about the recent Twitter, so-called Twitter refugee and Xiaohongshu issue, because when Twitter when TikTok was banned in India, it's like banned. There's no other option. It's completely banned. But right now, when this news about TikTok ban in America circulated, suddenly all the TikTok user of American like in America flock into the app called the Red Notebook. So suddenly people start turning to how did China in that case, like how I believe that the Red Note is somewhere linked to the Tencent, and then and the people who join in that Red Notebook all are talking about criticizing the American government. All right, so like, oh, we don't know that our government is so corrupted or something failure, and then other word praising China. So I was wondering how that swift, shift that like took place and happened, because when TikTok was banned in India, it's like banned, no other option, you know. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I just very briefly on that, and then I'm afraid I have to run. I think we're a little over time anyway, but I'm afraid I have to get to another meeting. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one thing that I'm expecting that we're going to see is changes in you know, how Xiaohongshu is being moderated, and, you know, the accessibility is going to quickly change. A lot of people have been talking about this recently and comparing the sort of initial elation at the access of, you know, the Clubhouse, that old you know, brief audio, you know, communication application that was very popular, quickly and available in China, and then quickly censored and blocked because it created a platform for engaging on topics that were otherwise censored in China. To date, Xiaohongshu has primarily just been used amongst Chinese language communities. So popular, oddly enough, quite popular in Taiwan also, despite, you know, much more rigorous sort of investigation, regulation around, you know, Chinese investments and so forth. But now that it's been opened up to a more global audience, you know, you do have Chinese users who are being, you know, next to, you know, global users, where then I think, you know, there's less control for information, sorry, there's less ability for information control than the, you know, Chinese censors prefer. Already there's some leaks of the company is rapidly trying to acquire English language content moderators to then hire to come into Xiaohongshu, because as English language users are flooding onto the app, the authorities are already like, oh, well, now we have to respond to the same level of information control that exists in the platform to date, and obviously that exists in other platforms. And again, looking at how there's a reason why TikTok isn't available in China. China had been banning TikTok from the beginning. It was only Douyin, right? Same company, different platforms, different content moderation. So again, I mean, I think there's a lot more to understand and to unpack here. On a final note, and a few people have already commented this elsewhere, so I don't take credit for it, but, you know, Xiaohongshu, the direct translation, Little Red Book, is like, you know, it's a play on words, obviously, like, you know, Mao's sort of, you know, aphorisms. It wasn't literally called, you know, Xiaohongshu in Chinese, but it's sort of like a direct reference and tongue-in-cheek to this level of like information control and propaganda. But branding it in English as Red Note is kind of a brilliant marketing ploy that sort of separates the like otherwise immediate sort of eliciting of propaganda and sort of, you know, this sort of authoritarian history, so that you have like all of these less informed users flooding to Red Note, which is really, you know, the like Little Red Book. Anyway, I think it's a really interesting conversation that's happening, and a lot more, I think, from the information threat and security perspective that we need to unwrap.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just add one last thing on that, like, because I think Michael already spoke a lot about what this thing is. I think one thing that I would say there's a difference between what happened in India and what happens in the US is there's also a difference in culture. Because like, if you think about TikTok, right, there was a lot of issues in India when TikTok was banned. There was a lot of people who were like, okay, because TikTok is banned, where there's a lot of TikTokers who actually made a living off TikTok, right? But there's this whole thing of like national security and all of that allowed the narrative to work in India. When TikTok was banned, people moved to Facebook or Instagram or something along the lines where it's more like a global platform. But in China, it was about like taking it's more in the US, right? It was about like taking away their rights, individual rights to use something. So I think those are certain things where like the whole play on Red Note, right, allowed that narrative to play so that people are moving to Red Note, right? But as Michael said earlier, right, yes, I think that's always going to be the case with China, right? When any tool or any app that kind of goes global, they really have to think about how that works, right? Because if you look at WeChat, as I was saying earlier, like when first WeChat was being used globally, it was almost the same. Even if you're using WeChat in Tibet or China and you're using WeChat globally, it was the same app almost. Then they started like segmenting, even though right now there is some connections, but it's a completely different experience, right? Because they have to. So I think that is what China has been able to do really well, which is very different from what other companies have been able to do, because most other companies always have their app, which is kind of like global. China is able to kind of really set that up in a way that allows them to censor, surveil in a very like repressive manner within their own borders and in Tibet and like East Turkestan and other places, but like in the global context that they're able to work within certain global norms.
Okay, I guess we don't have any more questions. So before we just wrap close the sessions, I would like to invite Professor Joyce. She is just a brief introduction. She's the director for our center, International Center for Culture Studies. So we have this year we have one new research cluster that largely focused on the digital governance. So you want to say something? Last conclusion?
Yeah, as we all know, this is an emerging and very serious situation globally. There's the age of chips and the rising emerging digital governance. We actually started to call for participation from around different, mostly South Asia, Southeast Asia, but also Central Asia and Africa, but also Europe, to think collectively, okay, how is this a model of governance or governmentality has changed from the age of 19th century, 20th century described or discussed by Michel Foucault. So could we generate not only analytic framework and also theorizing framework to discuss this 21st century phenomenon, but also to think whether any local bottom-up resistance could be possible, because we see the penetrating power, and also the territory with no boundary, and also the power with no limit that can monitor, control people. And the most disadvantaged community, they suffer the most. So, but we need to think different modes of human right activity that can be possible. Okay, so that we cannot. So that's just my some initial ideas that many of us are sharing. So we want to also start a project, and I look forward to our collaboration in the coming years. And maybe we don't just do research, we are really researching this human world that's facing the challenges. So we welcome your participation, and we will announce every one of our events will be including digital labor, including platform economy, but mostly there's a digital authoritarianism that concerns us the most. Okay, so we'll be seeing each other very often, I hope very often in the coming 2 years. And Doma, thank you so much for organizing this very meaningful forum. Yeah,
Okay.
keep in touch.
Thank
Howard, Roshan, Mahez, and Michael. Yeah.
Yep,
Thank
sure.
you so much.
Thank you so
Sure,
much.
sure. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Have
Bye-bye.
a good day.
Yeah.
Bye.